Let's go into Visual Studio and see how these different identity types are used. We could look at, for instance, this logon page. This must be part of the account controller, the login action. Let's take a look at the account controller and see how it uses identity. So before we even get to that, I do want to point out that the account controller by default does not allow access from anonymous users, because the account controller does contain some sensitive actions, like the action that will show a user profile, allow you to manage your profile, change your password. By default, we don't want anonymous users to get there. And so the authorize attribute is placed on the controller so that all actions, unless otherwise specified, are restricted to only authenticated users. But there are some areas of the account controller where an anonymous user has to be able to reach. For instance, when they want to log on. At that point, they haven't been authenticated. They need to be able to get to the view that presents the login form so they can enter their username and password, and then they can post their login credentials. And what the account controller will do is try to verify that you indeed entered the proper credentials. But it does that using a user manager. There's a method findAsync where we pass in the username and the password that was entered. If the user manager returns an object, that means we were able to successfully locate that user. They entered the right password. But if it returns null, that means they didn't provide the correct credentials. So instead of signing in the user, we'll add an error message to the view, return that login form again, and allow them to try to re-enter their password. So how is the user manager constructed and where does it come from? Well, back up at the top of the account controller, inside of the constructor, what the default parameter-less constructor will do is construct a new user manager against a type called application user, which we'll look at just a bit. But a user manager, remember, that's the domain logic. It knows how to validate things and knows how to make sure that a user entered the proper credentials. It needs something to talk to the database. So the object passed to the user manager constructor is the user store object. That's the user store, also from the entity framework identity assembly. A new user store that works with application user, and that user store implements a repository pattern, but it needs a database context to actually talk to SQL Server. That's where a new application DB context is instantiated. So user manager and user store we have talked about before in the slides. The new class here is the application DB context. We can find that in the models folder. Inside of the models folder, there are two classes. One are all the view models that are needed by the account controller. So view models that are essentially data transfer objects and provide some validation attributes to take input from a user when they're logging on or creating a new profile. And then there is the identity model. So the identity model.cs file also includes two classes. You might want to refactor those out into separate files. One is the application user. This represents the user in your application. What information do you want to store about that user? By default, it will inherit from identity user. It needs to do that to work with this identity.entity framework assembly, but you can add additional properties here. So for instance, if you wanted to store something additional about the user, perhaps something like their favorite book, then you can add a property here or multiple properties here, and anything that you add will get persisted into SQL Server, even when you're using the user manager. Of course, any properties that you add here, if that's something that you want the user to fill out while they're on their profile page, creating their profile, creating their login, that's where you would have to go into views, into the account controller views. And here's the view to log in. Here's the view to register. It's inside of register where you would want to provide an additional text box where a user could enter their favorite book when they're signing up for the site. And then you'd probably also want to display it perhaps on the manage view to allow them to change their favorite book. So this is one area where you can customize this a little bit. You can add additional properties to application user. And then application DB context, that is the DB context derived class that we use when we construct a user store. So this is an entity framework DB context that the user store will use when saving information into SQL Server. You'll notice it derives from identity DB context. That's one of the types that we looked at in the slide when we looked at Microsoft.ASP.NET.identity.entity framework. You have to derive from this class, unfortunately, unless you're going to implement your own user store, because this identity DB context manipulates the entity framework model just a bit internally so that it can set up the proper tables and set up the proper relationships to manage users and roles and logins and claims and have things joined together properly. Notice this DB context has a default constructor, but it passes along the name of the connection string that it wants to use to connect to the database. So if you want to change the connection string, the name of the connection string in your web.config, you would have to change the string here. Right now it's using default connection, and you might remember back in web.config, default connection is the connection string that we modified when we changed the name of the database. So that's where that bit of information is coming from. When we construct this DB context, it's saying, please use the default connection, that connection string from the config file. And inside of this DB context, if you wanted to use this for your application, for instance, if we were writing some project that manipulated and stored movie information, then we could have, let's say, a movie entity, and I could add to this class a property of type dbSet of movie. We'll call that movies. And now I would also have a movies table in SQL Server, but I will need to bring in system.data.entity for dbSet to be recognized. This would give me a movies table in SQL Server, and I could instantiate this application DB context anywhere in the application and get to movies and also get to users and roles directly through properties that are inherited from identity DB context. But it might be better to use the user manager to do that. It all depends on what you're actually trying to do. So one scenario that we frequently get into when it comes to membership is quite often we want to seed the application with some initial user data so that when we're in a testing environment or a development environment, when the database is created, we can just automatically come in and log in as some particular user. Well, right now I have two problems. The first problem is I cannot log in because there's no users in the database. The second problem is I have changed the application DB context to now include movie information. I've changed the user model to add a favorite book property. And now I'm getting this error that the entity framework detects that something about the model has changed. You need to do something to the database to get this to work. So I want to do two things here. I want to solve this problem and get past this error so that we can start using the database again. And in that process, I also want to seed the database with an initial user, so at least I can launch this application fresh from source control. It'll create a database and there'll be an saln user inside.